Today we have a Contabo review video. So Contabo provide VPSs at a very good budget price point. I'm going to be looking at the cheapest one today. That's only €5. That's about $6 US. I'm going to do a complete review and a lot of benchmarks. All right, so I've got a link in the description to these VPS plans. These are extremely generous in terms of how much resources you get for this price. So I'm just curious, what's the catch? These look kind of too good to be true at first glance. So I'm going to be running a lot of benchmarks and figuring out what is the catch, if any. So I'm going to be running Google PageSpeed Insights. I'm going to be running Sysbench. I'm going to do some network file transfer speed tests. I'm going to do load-to-IO load testing. I'm going to talk about having all this extra RAM compared to other places and what you can do with that extra RAM. And then we're going to go through some conclusions. So I've done heaps of research and heaps of testing. A lot more work has gone into this than my usual video. So if you could at least drop a comment or hit the like button, that would be super helpful. Even more helpful if you decide to go with any of these VPS ideas from watching my videos. If you use the links in my description, that really helps me out as well. So anyway, I'm Alex from IdeaSpot. Let's get started. All right, so we're over on Contabo. If you use the link in the description, it'll take you over here, the VPS plan. So I'm quite interested in these cheaper options, especially this €5 VPS S plan. So even though it says S, it's still quite generous in terms of the resources. You get 8 gigabytes of RAM and 4 CPU cores. You're also getting 32 terabytes of traffic. So that is quite huge compared to other VPSs at that price range. Now, we are using euros for the currency. If you change it to US dollars, it's slightly more expensive. Contabo is a German-based company, so it does end up being a little bit cheaper if you pay euros rather than US dollars. So that's $6.99 US versus €5. So I think that works out to about $6. So you save about $1 if you pay in euros. So if we were to compare this plan to the ones that we look at on the channel quite regularly, we look at that Vultr $6 plan, only gives you 1 terabyte, not 32 terabytes, only 1 gigabyte of memory, not 8 gigabytes of memory, and 32 gigabytes of storage. This will give you 50 gigabytes of storage on NVMe, 200 on SSD. So I'd go for the faster NVMe, to be honest, unless you really needed the extra storage. If we look at DigitalOcean, it's the same sort of comparison, only 1 terabyte of transfer, 1 CPU, and only 1 gigabyte of memory, and the storage is half, so only 25 gigabytes of NVMe storage. So I know what you're thinking, how can this be so much better in terms of its resources at the same price point? That's what I want to test today. I want to run through some benchmarks and see if you're making any performance sacrifices to get all these resources at this price point. So let's go ahead and select this one and see what the sign-up process is like here. First thing I noticed was there is a setup fee, €5 setup fee plus your €5 monthly fee. So your first month costs nearly €10. Now compared to DigitalOcean and Vultr, they have a free trial for your first month or even first 2 months. So paying a setup fee doesn't really feel that great in this industry at the moment. I think if you pay for 12 months, you can avoid the setup fee. But I think, again, most people, when they move to a new server, they want to try it out and see what it's like for the first few weeks. So having no free trial and having to pay a setup fee, that doesn't make it as attractive, but it's still not a lot of money for most people, I think. And the other thing was, if you want this €5 price, you're limited to European servers here. So the German data center costs €5, but if you want like the United States, you'll go up to €6. So straight away, it costs a little bit more if you want United States. And then Singapore in Asia is an extra €2.50. So if you just go for European Union, I actually want to go for the US East Coast for this demonstration because I always have my Vultr and my DigitalOcean servers on the East Coast. So I want to compare them. But I think if I just wanted to save money, I'd go for the European data center. But I think most of my audience will be around here anyway. So I'm going to go for this one. And then I'm going to stick to NVMe as my storage. The storage is smaller, but it's going to be faster with NVMe compared to 200 gigabyte SSD. So I think for serving websites, always go for NVMe. If you've got the choice, you can actually double that for an extra €1 as well for 100 gigabytes. But let's just go for the 50. And then I'm going to be using Ubuntu 20.04 because I'm going to be using CyberPanel, and that installs well on Ubuntu 20.04. The other thing you could do is WordOps, which again uses 20.04, but whichever way you go, Ubuntu 20.04, we're just going to install our panel on there and then install WordPress with our panel. They do have some choices of apps and panels that you can install during setup, but I didn't really like any of these options. cPanel and Plesk, they charge extra for all of those, and I'm not a fan of LAMP for running WordPress. I'd rather use Nginx or Open Lightspeed. Again, Webmin, same deal. Not really a fan of any of these choices. So Ubuntu 20.04, that lets us install Nginx through WordOps or Open Lightspeed through CyberPanel, which I'm going to do today. I'll show you that a bit later. And then it's worth noting here, you've got 32 terabytes of transfer per month. That is limited to 200 megabits per second, so that is throttled a little bit. We'll talk about how that affects performance a bit later. But that's probably one of the key differences because Vultr and DigitalOcean don't give any connection limiting. So this does have some effect, but we'll talk about that later. And then all of this will leave as default, basically. All right, so after you sign up, a few hours later, you'll get your email with your login data. So it's not instant, it does take a little while. So be patient while they set up your account. And you'll be able to go over to my.contabo.com and log in with your username and password. You'll also be able to remote into your VPS and log in with your root username here and your password to set up your server. So we're going to do that in just a second. But to start with, we'll head over to mycontabo.com and log in with our username and password there and just have a look at what their control panel actually looks like. All right, so we're in our customer account panel here. There's not a whole lot we can do. Most of what we can do is under VPS control. So you can restart your server if you need to restart. You can reinstall it back to scratch. You can do a rescue. You can take snapshots. So if you want to save the server in a certain instance, and be able to roll it back to that position if you're trying out different configurations and things, that can be handy. But again, not a whole lot we can do here. We can click manage and we can actually do password resets, which is useful if you forget your password or if you mess anything up. And server IP address. So I'm just going to take that server IP and go ahead and log in. All right, so I'm using Windows here, so I'm going to use PuTTY to connect to my server. If you're using a Mac, use Terminal. Either way, we're going to put in our IP address here and we're going to save it as Contabo S, and I'm just going to save that in there like that, and then we can click open. And so here we just log in as root, and I right click the password to paste that in. So, and then we hit enter to log in. That is just the password that we got from our login email here. So this is where I'm going to install CyberPanel. So that's just one command to install that. So just run that script. I have done this in a previous tutorial. So over on my blog and in the description as well, I'll put a link to that tutorial, but basically it's just that one command and then you follow the prompts and set up your CyberPanel. So I've got that video that I've made earlier. Very simple to do. Don't be scared of trying out running something from the command line. This is quite simple. You'll have your server up and running within 10 or 20 minutes without too much hassle. So I'm just going to skip ahead. As you can see, I've got my CyberPanel set up on my server now, and I'm using this demo domain ideaspot.site for this demonstration. So I've installed WordPress on here. I love CyberPanel for WordPress because Open Lightspeed, and it's a free panel as well. So very fast performance and free. So what's not to like there? I've set up my favorite theme on here, Cadence theme with the Cadence starter template. I like testing this because it's nice and clean and nice and fast. I can do some performance benchmarking on this website. Again, if you want the full details of this setup process, check out that previous video that I made on setting up CyberPanel and Open Lightspeed. It's very, very straightforward, honestly. But what I really want to concentrate on this video is the performance of Contabo and comparing that performance to my favorite Vultr and DigitalOcean server. So let's go ahead, just run a Google PageSpeed Insights on here. So straight away, we're seeing very solid performance here from Contabo, 99 overall score, all greens on our core web vitals. The most difficult one, largest contentful paint, that's still green at 1.8 seconds. So that's under our 2.5 limit. This is about 20% slower than Vultr and DigitalOcean because I've been able to get 1.5 seconds on Vultr and DigitalOcean for our LCP time. So about 20% slower. This is very lightweight. So if it was a heavy website, that performance difference might come into play a bit more. But with a very lightweight website here, that's totally fine. 1.8 is totally decent. But just be aware that that is about 20% or so slower than Vultr. So just to summarize here, Contabo is about 20% slower than our Vultr and DigitalOcean droplets that we've tested before. 1.5 second load time for those guys, 1.8 on Contabo, but still totally decent. We're still getting great scores, just a fraction slower on Contabo. Next up, we're going to run some Sysbench Benchmarks. I like using Sysbench because we can do database benchmarking, which is really the bottleneck when you're looking at WordPress dynamic content. So I'm going to go ahead and show those results. So with our MySQL performance in the database benchmark, Contabo is pretty solid, a little bit actually quicker than DigitalOcean for its database performance, but Vultr wins this benchmark by a fair margin actually. So we can see if you were looking at dynamic content, Vultr is going to be the quickest one, and similar effort from Contabo and DigitalOcean. Next up, we tested the file I/O. So Contabo's file input and output is actually quicker than the other options. So that was very promising. Now, it is worth noting that Contabo does have a network port limit. So even though the file input output is quicker on Contabo, we may actually see later on that Contabo's network limit does bottleneck this performance a bit in terms of running websites under load. So I'm going to show you how that has an effect a bit later on. But next we did the memory. The memory was all pretty even. Vultr was a little bit ahead, but in terms of memory, this is useful for serving cached content from your memory when you're doing websites. So very even, there's no trouble with any of these options. All right, so next up I tested some file transfer speed, just moving 1,000 megabytes worth of data. Contabo was way slower than DigitalOcean and Vultr in this test. So we can see Contabo is limited to that 200 megabit connection speed. In this case, the 43-second transfer works out to 186 megabits. So that seems about right. That's close to 200 as we saw earlier. Vultr and DigitalOcean much faster. So DigitalOcean, I was able to transfer it over a gigabit, Vultr 3 gigabits here. So only 2.5 seconds and 7.5 seconds for these guys. 43 seconds for Contabo to transfer that. So I think that's actually, it's not too bad. If there's light traffic on the server, Contabo's not going to suffer any slowdown, as we saw with the Google PageSpeed. It was still 1.8 seconds. It was still fast enough. It's just as you get multiple concurrent users, you get heavy traffic, these guys are going to start to shine with those unthrottled ports. 3 gigabits, 1 gigabit. I think that's much, much quicker in terms of being able to serve a heavy load of traffic to multiple visitors at the same time compared to Contabo. So I think this is probably the key difference. Basically, Contabo is giving you a cheap VPS with very good resources in terms of its RAM and CPU, but you're limited in terms of your network performance. So I think this is a very interesting comparison. I think to highlight this difference, if you head over to loader.io, you can run load testing, which is what I did in this case. So I really loaded up these servers with 200 clients per second and 500 clients per second, and then just check the response time in each case. So DigitalOcean and Vultr were able to handle both of these loads fairly comfortably. Vultr didn't even make a difference if I was using 200 or 500 clients. And Contabo, when I boosted the load test up to 500 clients, that's when it did hit some lag. So 2,536 milliseconds of response time compared to only 10 or 20 or 30 from DigitalOcean. So that's 2.5 seconds of extra lag that you're getting added. So under heavy load, that's where Contabo starts to struggle a little bit. But of course, 500 clients per second, that's a lot of load. I don't think most websites are going to get that, but that's just illustrating if you're under a heavy amount of load, these guys are going to perform better. As you grow websites and they become popular, these are going to still perform very strongly. Contabo will start to struggle as the load gets high. But again, 500 is a lot. 200, it still managed the test just fine compared to the other ones as well. So 200 clients per second was just fine on Contabo. I think for most people, the performance is going to be fine for as long as the traffic doesn't get too heavy. One thing people are worried about when they see this sort of price with 4 CPU cores and 8 gigabytes of RAM, they think, oh, okay, maybe they are overloading these servers and the CPU is going to suffer. We're going to maybe lose some of the CPU performance because it's being overloaded. Over on VPS benchmarks, they kind of address this by running sustained CPU endurance on these servers, and they have metric called CPU steal. So that is how much CPU performance is actually lost due to being shared with other VPSs on the server. So it's not too bad on Contabo. It's not zero, but 4.2% is the average loss of CPU, and the maximum was 10.98. We can actually see how that compares to other VPSs on here as well. So basically, as a result of being in a VPS environment, you've got a virtual CPU, and the virtual CPU is 4.2% slower than an equivalent physical CPU in the case of Contabo. So average 4.2, maximum was 10.98. These aren't too bad. You don't need to worry about them particularly. It's just worth comparing that Vultr's virtual CPUs and say compared to Google's E2 High CPUs are pretty much exactly the same as a physical CPU in terms of their performance, only a very fraction of a percentage slower than a physical CPU. DigitalOcean was between 2 and 5% slower than the physical CPU equivalent. But for those of you who are worried about Contabo being overloaded, it doesn't really seem like that's the case. You do lose a little bit of CPU performance to being in that shared environment with the VPS, but they have engineered it so that you still get most of the performance out of the CPU and it's not completely overloaded here. I did find a little bit more discussion about CPU steal time over on Scout APM. I'll link that in the description, but basically, if it's an average under 10%, I think you're going to be fine. You're not really going to notice any slowdown from having a virtual CPU in those cases. Now, I just wanted to mention RAM because this is one of Contabo's biggest advantages. You get 8 gigabytes of RAM on Contabo, only 1 gigabyte of RAM on the other guys. When it comes to running WordPress sites, the number of WordPress sites is typically bottlenecked by the amount of RAM that you have on the server. So generally, as a rule of thumb, you could run 10 websites pretty safely on 1 gigabyte. So if you've got 8 gigabytes, you could 8x that. You could have 80 websites running on that cheap Contabo server. So if you're in that situation where you need to run a lot of websites, say you're a small freelancer or small agency and you want to run a lot of hosted WordPress websites, this is where Contabo is really going to shine for you, because those extra resources translate to just hosting a lot more websites than what is capable on Vultr and DigitalOcean for the money. So while these ones are slightly faster and handle heavy traffic better, you can just have much more greater quantity on Contabo. So that is the big advantage. So these are quite different products when you look at it in these terms. One last thing I wanted to touch on was uptime with Contabo. I haven't had the server for very long, so I can't really say how the uptime is long term. So far, it's been 100% totally fine. Let me know in the comments if you're using Contabo, and let me know what your uptime has been like. I'd be interested in knowing that part. In comparison with Vultr, Vultr's been rock solid for me. I am in the New Jersey data center. I've never had a problem. I did reset my server back in March for 3 minutes, so that's why that was caused. That was me, not anything to do with Vultr. So otherwise, 100% up for over 4,000 hours now since March. So really good from Vultr. And I've never had any problem with DigitalOcean either. So yeah, just let me know how Contabo's uptime has been. If you've got experience, just let me know in the comments. All right, so in terms of our conclusion, Contabo is excellent value. It's a very different product from Vultr and DigitalOcean, which we've covered a lot on the channel before. So Contabo's selling point is that high RAM and traffic allowance that's much more generous. Also a very high traffic limit in terms of 32 terabytes of transfer. So 8 gigabytes of RAM, you can host way more websites, but yeah, it's very different from what we've tested before. It would actually be suitable for other things besides running websites. So if you're doing file sharing, game servers, if you're hosting video, 32 terabytes of traffic transfer a month, that's going to be great. Running websites was a little bit slower on Contabo, but again, the resources, it just gives you a much different scope for different applications compared to Vultr and DigitalOcean. So Contabo's website performance was still solid, but it was notably slower than Vultr and DigitalOcean. We saw that with our largest contentful paint being about 20% slower, and the load testing numbers from Vultr and DigitalOcean being a lot better than Contabo. But I think Contabo is still in that situation where you just need the extra resources and you want to host a lot of websites. I think this is really cool. So the situation where I'd recommend Contabo is if you were very limited in terms of your budget and you just want to host a large number of WordPress websites and the small performance difference doesn't concern you. So maybe those of you in developing countries where you have very tight budgets and you really want to squeeze a lot of websites onto your server, I think this is going to be a good choice. I think for the rest of us where we only have 2 or 3 projects that we're working on and we just want the fastest possible speed, I'd still recommend Vultr if you just want the best possible speed on your website. So I'm going to stick for Vultr for most of my projects, but I think there's going to be definitely applications where Contabo is going to be suitable for your use case. So if you're interested in trying Contabo and you found this video helpful, it would be really nice if you use the link in the description when you signed up. That helps the channel a lot. Also, don't forget to like and comment. All that good stuff really helps me out. I'll put up the video at the end of this one showing you how I set up the Open Lightspeed and Cyber panel like I did in this video. So if you want to use that setup on your Contabo server, you can use that method. I'll put that up here. But thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.